purposes to influence public opinion or policy. 2, by failing to disclose her membership of HSRA at the 28th of November meeting, she breached paragraph 5.5, which requires disclosure of non-pecuniary interests as defined in that paragraph. And then finally, 3, by failing to declare that interest and failing to exclude herself from consideration of item 109/19 by withdrawing from the chamber, she breached paragraphs 5.1, 6.4 and 6.5 of the Code of Conduct, which you can see on page 21 and 23 of your books. After I submitted my final report to the monitoring officer, at that point it became his report. It was for him to issue the report and to determine what to do next in accordance with the council's arrangements for dealing with standards complaints. And that's why we're here today. Thanks for listening, and I will be pleased to answer any questions that the panel might have on this. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Clearly, you've investigated the point about the residents, the first point to start with. Is it often that you find yourself 100% sure?
Well, it's very hard. When I say 100% sure, yeah. I'm saying 99.9% sure. No, it isn't.
No. It's the website that really was the...
It was the website, the Facebook page, the minutes, the other documents, the public stuff that went, newsletters. I was left in no doubt at all that that's what it was about. And Councillor Barton didn't really address that in her statement. She talked about other things. There has been reference to the fact that to the witnesses that I talked about, it wasn't really the witnesses that featured here. It's about hard evidence, and it's now, whether it's still there, I couldn't tell you, but certainly at the time when I did the investigation, it was all there, it was very clear. I seem to recall that there was about 13 months of Facebook posts that had disappeared. They weren't there. I don't know why they weren't there, and I wasn't able to look at them. But even apart from that, the evidence was crystal clear. It was HSRA at that time was about opposing development at Redcourt.
The next point.
Chair,
sorry.
Apologies. I don't know if the investigator wants to call any witnesses before you proceed with the questions from the chair, because it's part of his presenting his report.
Oh yes. Do you want? Yes, you've got one witness here. Do you wish to call Mr. Bainbridge?
I'm not sure that at this stage that I would wish it might be that later in the
there isn't another opportunity.
Okay.
You need to call him as part of your evidence.
Okay. Perhaps I could ask Mr. Bainbridge to comment briefly on the advice that he gave to Councillor Barton about declaring interests.
Yeah, so gave advice to Councillor Barton twice. First at the training session that was run in 2019, which Mr. Kenny referred to his report, and which Councillor Barton has referred to in her response, and then later in directly with Councillor Barton. The advice was the same both times. It was about providing a framework for the councillor to make a decision in relation to any interest they might have. Now, at the training session, that first session, that was quite generic. Obviously, as Mr. Kenny says, I said to Mr. Kenny, the clerk had informed himself, Mr. Taylor, that this issue might come up. It might be in relation to a particular site. And that was the kind of thing that was going to come up, at least in part, at that session, and it did. But the advice that I gave was very much, look, these are the factors you need to consider. when making the decision as to whether you should take part in the debate around the planning application or matter of planning policy when it comes before the council. And the advice was very much the same later on as well. So that was really it. I hesitate as deputy monitoring officer as I was here to tell a councillor you should or you must or must not sit, be that borough councillor or town and parish councillor, you must or must not sit in that chamber. I do think it's for them ultimately to decide. You cannot force as an officer a member to not enter the chamber. You can go as far as you can in saying, you know, very, very strongly advise you not to take part in that debate, but you can't say no. And so, it wasn't my place, I don't believe it would be any monitoring officer's place to say to, particularly in a training session like that, yes, in those circumstances, you shouldn't enter the chamber. And of course, we were talking hypothetically. But yeah, as I said, very much it was consistent advice on those occasions. Here's the framework within which you would make that decision, and that's it. Yeah.
No, I have no further question of Mr. Bainbridge. Might I just go back to your point about 100%? Notwithstanding my 100% or 99% certainty, I'm required to make a judgment based on the bounds of probability, and this was well beyond the bounds of probability.
So right now we can ask questions of both Mr. Bainbridge and Mr. Kenyon, or
Yes, Chair.
just quickly on Mr. Bainbridge. I think it's right, is it not, that you were never asked actually specifically by Councillor Barton at the time of the November meeting as to whether or not to declare an interest? I.e. when they were going to discuss the neighbourhood plan?
No, it was. Well, I think any council is looking for advice as to whether they should, or whether they should or not declare interest. I mean, I can't think of an example in my time here or where I'm currently where, ultimately that isn't the question. So no, I think ultimately that is the advice that Councillor Barton should or should not. As I say, there's only so far that we can go. I couldn't sit there with her on the phone with her and say, you mustn't take part in that debate.
She never asked the question, that's the point.
Yeah.
And did she ever ask the question as to how to fill in the declaration of interest form when she became a councillor, as to whether the HSRA is something that she should have put on her register of interest? Did she ask you that?
No.
Anybody got any questions, Mr. Bainbridge?
No.
Carry on, Mr. Kenyon, with you. It's been suggested by Councillor Barton that there's a distinction between planning application and discussing generally a neighbourhood plan, on the basis that, of course, if there was a planning application, she'd declare an interest. But when it came to the neighbourhood plan, particularly bearing in mind she discussed it in March 19 as well, that it was just a general matter and she shouldn't have to declare an interest. What comment would you make on that?
I would say that of course there's a difference between a planning application and the neighbourhood plan. But as far as I'm concerned, that's not really a relevant point. What's relevant is the fact that they were discussing the neighbourhood plan on that evening. And as I've said in my statement, the neighbourhood, that version of the neighbourhood plan which various councillors and others, I think, had been working on that summer, had changed from the March 2019 version, which, to be absolutely fair to Councillor Barton, she had voted for, and the November 2019 version. And that key change, the key change in that, as far as HSRA was concerned, was the shift in the settlement boundary. Now, my understanding is it was not just a shift in respect of Redcourt. There were other, I gather, changes to the settlement boundary in that plan. And reference has also been made to that generalised nature. But those who were involved in HSRA knew the importance of even that generalised shift in the settlement boundary to the possibility or probability of development for housing of the Redcourt site.
Do you know if there was sort of debate on the 28th of November about the Redcourt boundary? Is this something that you have any evidence about?
I think I do have some evidence, but I can't recall where it was. I think it's in the report, or I think someone told me that the debate was quite prolonged, whether it was the clerk or whoever told me. I cannot honestly remember. But I was left with the impression that there had been quite some considerable debate. It may be that the minutes gave that impression, but again, I wouldn't like to be definitive about that.
So I suppose a councillor could declare an interest and say, if we debate the Redcourt boundary, then I declare an interest on that. But if we're discussing something else in Hazelmere or the other side of town, then I can take part in it.
I think I would prefer to refer that question, if I may, to the legal.
Right. We can ask the legal. And then, of course, she makes it clear in her statement that she decided, she analysed her situation. She decided that people that knew her. She decided that they would realise that she would be neutral and wouldn't be biased and so on, and therefore didn't declare an interest because of that. And as you made it clear, it's not her perception, but it's the public perception. Man on the Clapham omnibus going back to good old days in the past.
As Mr. Bay, it's kind of in line with what Mr. Bainbridge said. It is her, whether to declare is her decision. It remains her decision. I think that's what Mr. Bainbridge was saying. But what's at issue, and I'll see if I can quote it again, is not actual bias, but the appearance of the risk of the appearance of risk, or risk of appearance of the appearance of risk of bias, or the other way around. It is what others might think. It isn't. I don't think anybody has suggested. I'm certainly not suggesting that she's got malign motives in this. It's for her to make that decision, and in doing that, you go back to the code of conduct, which refers to what others might perceive rather than what she herself perceives.
And the principle of if in doubt, declare.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And she also says somewhere in her statement, I think, that there were no special circumstances or no strong, I can't remember the wording in that she should actually leave the chamber. So even if she had declared it, she could have stayed. Can you comment on that?
I think that
Strong
depends.
presumption.
I think that, well, again, I think we're back to the interpretation of the code of conduct, which perhaps our legal friends over there might comment on. And I think it's probably better if they comment.
Okay, well, we'll ask our legal officer when we finish. Her advice.
I mean, what she certainly could have done is, irrespective of that point, is she could have made whatever statement she wanted, as it were, a member of the public might be able to do about that particular circumstance without taking part in the debate. So she could have made that
Made a statement and then
as I
left the
understand
chamber and left the debate to others. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. One or two questions. You talked about Red Court as being one of the primary issues of this problem, but essentially the issue is her membership of HSRA and what HSRA are doing in the general sense. For example, members have attended the Hazelmere Parish Council planning meetings and spoken at those meetings, which is, is an attempt to sway public opinion in those matters. So my question there is, does it matter that she's a member of HSRA if her husband has such a prime role? She's still bound by the same rules. Her husband runs HSRA, part-time, a chair on occasion. So doesn't she have an issue in any case because of her husband's involvement?
Certainly when it comes to things like property, those have to be declared on the declaration of pecuniary interests and other interests. Whether her husband as chair is, again, I think we're into legal territory here. But the fact is she is the councillor and she's a member, and certainly as witnesses have said, members of HSRA appeared at town council meetings and apparently made representations about development there. So I think that what I focus this on is her membership rather than her husband's chairpersonship of that. I think my understanding is that there was a period during which he wasn't chair, and that may have been to do with the negotiations that were going on in relation to some land that abutted their home. So he wasn't chair all the time, and I wouldn't know exactly what the timing of that actually was. In fact, I think I asked the question and didn't get an answer, or at least one that I understood clearly. So I focused on Councillor Barton's membership of HSRA.
Okay, thank you. A separate question, when you talked to Councillor Barton, did you ask her specifically the reasons why she did not take the advice of the Hazelmere Town Clerk in declaring an interest?
I'm not. My understanding is that the Hazelmere Town Clerk gave the similar kind of advice to Mr. Bainbridge. I don't think the Hazelmere Town Clerk, who's obviously not here to speak for us, have said you must or you must not. What she certainly did do is she got into contact with Councillor Barton and asked her to reflect on the upcoming item. I think Mr. Taylor did speak to the town clerk about her view on this matter, and I think that's reflected in the report. But I don't think that I don't recall that the town clerk said you must, and I think that is very much in line with the advice that
That's what we understand. She was giving advice. I just want to put some specific comments that Councillor Barton had made to you.
I would have to get the transcript out. If it's not referred to in the report, I would have to get the transcript of the discussion out. There is a verbatim transcript, but it's clearly not presented there.
Sorry, yes, if I just ask one quick question. How did you define that she was actually a member of HSRA? And is there anything defining the dates that she became a member?
I don't believe there's anything that defines a date. The first point is she has never done anything other than say, yes, I was a member.
Okay, yeah, that's all I wanted.
Yeah, and I think even in her statement, I'm not absolutely sure, but again, in her statement, I think it's not at issue she was a member.
Thank you.
In order to become a member at that time, you, loosely speaking, clicked on a button, put your email details in, and then got things like newsletters and emails and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just interested on that point on page 13. There is a sentence there that supports what you said, of course. But it says no real disagreement. Is there any meaning into that phrase, no real disagreement?
Sorry, when you said
That's on
page 13 of my report.
Page 13. On the past tables.
That's the margin officers.
Robin addressed his Taylor's words, no real disagreement. Does that suggest there was some issue with
Sorry, I could.
Page 13.
There is no real disagreement. I think Councillor Barton actually, it may even be in the patch, he actually says so. As I said, her husband was chair. The inaugural meeting, as I understand it, at which, if you like, HSRA was born, took place in the garden of her home, as I understand it. And she, by her own admission, she's quite a high profile figure in Hazelmere. But she doesn't pretend that she wasn't a member of HSRA. I think she actually says, I am a member of HSRA, or was. Certainly she was in 2020 by definition, but yes, she said, I made no secret of it.
Yes.
Mr. Kendall. When I was reading through the comprehensive report and all the evidence, it stated, I haven't got the page reference, that Councillor Barton understood the code, was a very experienced counsel at various levels of government. Did she give any indication, maybe it's in the transcript, of why HRSA wasn't included in her initial pecuniary interest when she was re-elected? She gave any information?
My recollection is that she describes it as a sort of plain, my word, vanilla
So that was the
residence. I believe so, yeah.
I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, she said she understood, she had the training, she very experienced counsel.
She, as I understand it, she had been a county councillor for some time. I don't know, I don't recall exactly when. And I think she'd had a stint as a town council for a year or two before 2019. That's my understanding.
All right, thank you.
I think both of your questions could possibly be answered by paragraph 54, page 118 of the report, which is Councillor Barton's statement.
She refers to things like Easter egg hunts and emphasises the generic nature of HSRA.
Okay, yeah, I did read that. I just want to be as part of the transcript, and if Councillor Barton was here, I would ask that question based on the evidence and of the political nature of influence.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Do you want to release Mr. Bainbridge so you can do some? If you want to leave, Mr. Bainbridge, I think your role has finished. If you wish to leave, then you have to practice permission.
Thank you, I'll stay. Thank you.
Right, well, now moving back to the procedure that we have agreed. The next is the statement of the subject matter. Now, we have received from Councillor Barton a statement that she wishes to have read out. Also, for completeness, we have been given an email that she's sent to the monitoring officer on the 18th of July, raising various issues which have been answered, I think, in an email of the 20th of July, which largely left it to raise it with the panel at the hearing if you wish to do so. But panel do agree that the statement of Councillor Barton should be read out, and I'm suggesting that it should be read out by Louise Fleming, the Democratic Services Manager, as being the most neutral person present. So could I ask, therefore, Louise Fleming to read the statement that was sent last night or this morning? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, members of the panel. This complaint is motivated by revenge and money. The complaints letter of March 2020 was explicitly written on behalf of the Property Development Company, which is owned by a man resident in Somerset together with his associates. Redwood Southwest Limited owns land in Hazelmere, which it wants to develop. The land is outside the urban zone for development. The developer has tried to persuade local councillors to support the development plans. This included offering me land next to my house in an email sent to my council email address if I publicly gave my support as a councillor to the development. The email stated that your public support for our proposals is a prerequisite. This evidence was ignored by the independent investigator and was excluded from his deliberations and the final report. It is obvious that my rejection of the developer's attempt to entice me in this way led directly to their complaint. The complaint was initially made through their lawyers, Clark Wilmot, then through their employed consultant promoter, Mr. Cox, and his close associate, Mr. Benson. It is misleading in the extreme for the monitoring officer and Mr. Kenyon to confirm in a conversation between themselves, see paragraph 5.3 of the investigation report, that they were to regard the complaint made by Redwood Southwest Limited as being made by Mr. Cox instead, as this firstly ignores the origin of the complaint as being made by a property developer, and secondly, risks ignoring the fact that Mr. Cox, as well as Mr. Leet, as he stated in his interview with Mr. Kenyon, was a representative himself of the property developer, and on whose behalf he communicates throughout the period of the investigation. The relevant item at the November 2019 Town Council meeting was to consider the entirety of the town's neighbourhood plan, a policy document and plan, rather than make decisions on any site-specific planning proposal. The draft neighbourhood plan was approved without a single member voting against. Not a single councillor declared a personal interest, even though they are all affected by the plan. I had cast my vote in favour of an earlier draft of the town-wide neighbourhood plan in March 2019, which had a settlement boundary that included the Red Court development site, among others. Objectively weighing up the critical need for the town to have a plan in place in order to contribute important policy considerations, which local residents across the town wanted for effective overall development locally. I cast my vote in favour of the final draft town-wide neighbourhood plan in November 2019, which had a settlement boundary that excluded the Red Court development site, among others. Objectively weighing up the same need for the town to have a plan and the various views of local residents and community organisations across the town, including Hazelmere Vision, regarding the policies desired for effective overall development locally. In the exercise of my judgment, as required under the Code of Conduct, at all times, including in respect of parish council meetings of both March and November 2019, I carefully considered whether any personal interest that I was likely that I have was likely to impair my objectivity or independence as a councillor. At all times, that consideration, as required under the code, included factoring into my own evaluation and judgment what an informed member of the public would think. The Code of Conduct did not require me to substitute the judgment of anybody other than myself in this context. As regards the non-disclosure of my membership of a residents' association, in 2018 when I joined HSRA, and again in 2019 when I was re-elected to the parish council, I did not register my membership on the Register of Disclosable Interests. Quite simply, I would not have considered it fell into a relevant category. Either as a charity, it is not registered as a charity, or as a body that influences public opinion. It is not established to do that and is nothing like the political parties or campaigning charities given as examples on the register or in LGA guidance. I note that one parish councillor has included the National Trust and the Woodland Trust on his register of interests as bodies that influence public opinion. The National Trust states on its website that it, quote, helps to look after the places where people live and engaging in shaping good housing and infrastructure development. Perhaps this is sufficient for the National Trust to be a registrable interest at Waverley or in Hazelmere, but it is not clear. In the same way, it is not clear that simple membership of HSRA, some of whose purposes might be similar to the National Trust, requires registration for the specific purposes that registration is intended in Hazelmere's Code of Conduct. I refer the panel to my advance written statement that sets out the requirements of the Code of Conduct, the nature of the allegation, my relevant conduct, some observations with regard to matters of natural justice and due process, and my submissions to the panel regarding why the complaint and allegations should be dismissed. In a nutshell, the nature of my interest in being a member of HSRA is not so significant as to undermine my objectivity and would not be perceived so by an ordinary member of the public. The fact I voted for both drafts of the neighbourhood plan in March 2019 and in November 2019 proves the point. My intent has always been honest, and I have acted in good faith at all times with respect to making declarations of personal interests. I have exercised objective judgment in relation to the neighbourhood plan decision-making as shown by my vote to support the March 2019 draft, as well as the November 2019 draft. On numerous occasions, I have declared my personal interests, whether pecuniary or non-pecuniary, with respect to agenda items and discussions, not only at the council and its committees, but also at meetings of HSRA. I have attended training on the Code of Conduct since the meeting of the 28th of November 2019. Nearly 2 years ago, I rectified the alleged non-disclosure on the council's register of interests. I have never sought to hide any personal interest and adopted a prudent approach with respect to making disclosures, conducting myself with no less a degree of integrity than any of my fellow parish councillors. I have specifically rejected the possibility to put my personal interests ahead of my public duties as a parish councillor. This is evidenced by my rejection of an offer of land by the developer complainant in exchange for my public support as a councillor for their proposed development scheme on the Red Court estate. Even with respect to the location of the settlement boundary within the draft neighbourhood plan, the neighbourhood plan was never going to be definitive as regards any specific site. Firstly, it was a policy document, not a site allocation document. Secondly, as shown by the latest successful appeal by the developer complainant of its planning application, it was not something that could actually stop development outside the settlement boundary. Lastly, I would make a general introductory observation that the objective of local government codes of conduct is to help ensure the public have confidence in those entrusted with decision making. Applying that objective to this hearing, means that the public's confidence will be based on whether fairness, proportionality and consistency are seen in any decision. 1, fairness must be seen in the context of a vindictive and malicious complaint coordinated by a property developer who could not buy my support. 2, proportionality must apply for an allegation of failing to declare a non-pecuniary interest, generally viewed as a minor breach, over 2.5 years ago at a parish council meeting, against a background of my properly declaring interests in planning meetings, where the code of conduct itself was confusing and focuses on a councillor's individual judgment. 3, consistency must be seen when comparing how this case is handled with others that have been handled by Waverley Borough Council and the Parish Council, when local residents have complained about other parish councillors' conduct and non-declarations. I trust the panel to evaluate the facts and circumstances accordingly, and I invite you to disregard the investigating officer's analysis of the significance of my personal interest in membership of HSRA and dismiss his finding that I breached the Parish Council's Code of Conduct. Thank you for your attention, Councillor Nicky Barton.
Thank you very much. Clearly, what we would have done next would be to have asked Councillor Barton various questions, challenging her evidence and so on. But that we can't do. So we have read a detailed statement. We have heard the statement today. And we will weigh that up in the balance with the rest of the evidence that is before us. And we can do no more than that. So moving on, we now go to the independent person. This is Annex 5 on page 139, where we have a short statement from Vivian Cameron. Is there anything you want to add to it?
Not really. I do feel, which I'm really reiterating that I've written, that this thing is spiraled into control to what the actual focus of the breach of the code of conduct is. And certainly just listening to that statement, clearly, again, a lot more is being pointed to it than why we're here today. Certainly listening to Mr. Kenyon's report, he clearly has made it very clear to me and that he is 100% clear that the code has been breached, and from what his findings, I do agree with that.
Any questions? No. Right, thank you very much. So the next stage is the page. It is summing up. Firstly, by the investigating officer, anything you want to, I think we will be seeking, I will be asking the solicitor present to advise us in open. There's questions we might ask you, but I think we'll deal with that after final submissions. And I think that's right. Or should we be asking you questions first before the final submissions?
If there are some legal points that you want to raise,
Probably we ought to do that first.
Now, yes.
I think we ought to do that first. Okay. The question is, I suppose, that where we have, I don't think you can help on the legal side as to whether this is a political organisation or whatever. That's a factual matter which we can deal with. But there's an element of choice, if you like, in whether you declare a non-pecuniary interest. And I think Councillor Barton has made it clear that in her view, her evaluation of it is what matters rather than another way. Could you explain to the panel the sort of thought processes when a member is perhaps being invited to consider whether or not they should declare a non-pecuniary interest?
So there are two paragraphs in the Hazelmere Members Code of Conduct from May 2019 that are relevant to your consideration. The first one is paragraph 5.5, which is on page 22. And this deals with the non-pecuniary interests which are required to be registered. I think there was also a question earlier about whether it was a requirement that her husband's leadership of the organisation required registration. That is not covered by paragraph 5.5. So just to be clear, I'll read out 5.5, which says, do be aware that the council has decided that it is appropriate for you to register and disclose non-pecuniary interests that arise from your membership of or your occupation of a position of general control or management in the following bodies. Bodies to which you have been appointed or nominated by the council, bodies exercising functions of a public nature, bodies directed to charitable purposes, and bodies one of whose principal purposes include the influence of public opinion or policy. In relation to paragraph 5.5 and the registration, it does not refer to the councillor's own opinion. That is going back to the public's perception and whether or not there is a risk. It is a requirement of the council that if they are a member of a body such as meets the requirements of set out in paragraph 5.5, including one whose principal purposes include the influence of public opinion or policy, it should be registered. So in that regard, you need to consider whether or not you consider HSRA to be a body, one of whose principal purposes include the influence of public opinion and policy. And if you conclude that it is such a body, then that should have been registered. Moving on then, you also need to have regard to paragraph 6.4. And this is in relation to participation at meetings, and it's on page 23 of your papers. And this requires that councillors do declare any other non-pecuniary interests that you consider to have sufficient weight so as to undermine your ability to make an open-minded and objective decision. Where this is the case, do exclude yourself from consideration of the item by withdrawing from the chamber for the duration of it being discussed. In making a judgment about whether a non-pecuniary interest is of sufficient weight as to undermine your objectivity, you should consider what an ordinary member of the public with knowledge of the relevant facts would think. So in relation to both of the questions I think you raised there, the first one as to whether or not it is her opinion. Yes, it is her opinion, but paragraph 6.5 gives very clear guidance as to how that opinion should be reached. And that's in consideration of what an ordinary member of the public with knowledge of the relevant facts would think. I think there was also a question about what she would have needed to do if she considered that there was a non-pecuniary interest. And I think, again, 6.4 is very clear that you have to withdraw from the chamber for the duration that you discussed. So she would not have been able to remain present.
Yes, because I think she was saying there is no rules to say that I have to go. I think her evidence said something on the lines that it doesn't say just because you've got a non-pecuniary interest, you've got to leave the chamber.
Yes.
So clearly there is sufficient weight test. And in your view, if you were advising Councillor of this situation with Red Court and the boundary and so on, that you said that this is something that would be sufficient weight to leave the chamber?
I don't think it would be right for me to answer that question. You have the view already of the borough solicitor who provided advice and training. And you also have in the papers before you the advice that was given by the parish clerk, I believe. So,
Yeah, these are those.
yes. So I wouldn't say that you should substitute my view for their views. You have the legal advice that was given to you.
Any questions about our legal officer?
Just maybe a minor one, legal one, going back to 5.5. When the phrase is used, influence of public opinion or policy. How do you define influence in that sense? Just having a conversation with somebody? Where do we draw the boundary between conversation and doing something more open, let's say?
I think you have to apply again, the principle of what everyone would think is the meaning of that word, and the general English meaning of the word influence, which is to try and sway opinion.
Just by speaking about something you are effectively influencing the party.
No, I'm just deliberating, maybe we can discuss it.
Fine. Thanks very much for that, and I think we now, if you wish to sum up, you have the right to do so.
Just one point that I just would like to pick up on, and that is that I was certain, insofar as anybody ever can be certain, about the nature of HSRA. That's what I was sure about, based upon the evidence that was in front of me. And as I said, it was beyond the balance of probability. So that's what I was sure about. I was going to make a statement at this point about what this was not about. It wasn't about process before I got involved. It wasn't about how long it had taken or how much it had cost. It wasn't about an anonymity. It wasn't about whether the complaints were vexatious or malicious, because the monitoring officer and the independent person would have dealt with that. And I believe that that was part of the considerations of Mr. Cornwall's report. It wasn't about the nastiness and unpleasantness that seems to have surrounded this, which obviously I deplore and would very much prefer not to be in the middle of. It's not actually about whether any attempt was made to persuade Councillor Barton to give her support. Councillor Barton suggested I had ignored that. I didn't ignore it. I simply told her on the 22nd of November 2019, if you believe, 2021, if you believe that some kind of inducement has been made, it's not me you need to be talking to. It's if you think an offence has been committed, you should direct it to the relevant authorities. I can't investigate something like that. It's not about the merits of the neighbourhood plan or otherwise. It's not actually about what other councillors have done or not done. You've got a policy and you've got a code of conduct in front of you. And it's definitely not about the merits or not of the case for building houses at Redcourt, which I'm sure we've all got our own private views on. So I simply wanted to make those points about what it's not about. It's about the 4 questions that I addressed at the very beginning, which are, I think, effectively answered in my report. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We don't have the opportunity of summing up from Councillor Barton. So that concludes the hearing. What we're now going to do is retire. I'm going to ask Louise Fleming to retire with us so that she can take a note of what we want to say. And I'm going to ask the law officer to come with us as well, in case any legal issues arise when we're considering it. I'm not inviting anybody else to join us, so we will not be monitoring. So I don't see any need for that. So we will now retire and we'll be back as soon as we can, but we'll see how long it takes. Certainly half an hour, probably, something like that. So we carefully consider all the evidence that we've heard. Thank you. Right, well, thank you very much. The panel have carefully considered all the evidence before it contained in our papers, together with the statement of Councillor Barton read out this morning. The conclusions of the panel were unanimous, and the panel decided as follows. 1. Councillor Barton, at all relevant times, was acting in an official capacity as a councillor. 2. The Hazelmere South Residents Association was a body where one of the principal purposes included the influence of public opinion or policy, in that, for example, they publicly declared and campaigned against development at Red Court. 3. In view of the nature of the Hazelmere South Residents Association, Councillor Barton should have entered this body in her formal declaration of interests with Hazelmere Town Council. 4. With regard to the meeting on the 28th of November 2019, when the neighbourhood plan was being discussed, Councillor Barton should have declared a non-pecuniary interest as the boundaries adjacent to Red Court were being discussed and decided upon. The panel takes the view that, taking into account the provisions of paragraphs 6.4 and 6.5 of the Hazelmere Code of Conduct, Councillor Barton should have left the meeting when the Red Court boundary was being discussed, i.e. item 109(19). The panel agree with the conclusions of the external investigating officer, Mr. Melvin Kenyon. This decision will be published by the Waverley Borough Council, and the Hazelmere Town Council informed of the panel's findings, so that they, Hazelmere Town Council, can decide such action that they consider appropriate. Councillor Barton has 14 days from today to appeal against the panel's decision, if she so wishes. Thank you. That concludes our